Suicide of the West. An essay on the meaning and destiny of liberalism. James Burnham. Chapter 5, Equality and Welfare.
Overcoming ignorance through the universal dialogue, and reforming the faulty institutions inherited from the past, men will be in a position to move toward peace, freedom, justice, and well-being. Let us now see how liberalism imagines the structure of the good society within which those values will be realized. 12. It is implicit in the principles already examined that liberalism holds a democratic theory of government.
The great contribution of Rousseau to the making of the liberal state.
Writes Professor Shapiro, and he is probably correct to single out Rousseau from the many others who were more or less simultaneously thinking toward similar conclusions.
Was the doctrine of popular sovereignty as expressed in universal suffrage.
Let us add that the strict liberal rule for the exercise of the suffrage must be, one man, one vote, man, in the generic sense, of course, male or female. All other suggested grounds for sovereignty are prejudices or superstitions inherited from the obsolescent past: divine right, patrician blood, race, property, priesthood, wisdom. Government is legitimately based on, and only on, the general will, the will of the people, and of all the people, or at any rate all adults other than the insane and criminal, expressed through the arithmetic of the electoral process. This democratic theory of sovereignty, like most of the other symptoms I am describing, is included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as proclaimed by the General Assembly of the United Nations. Article 21, paragraph 3, reads:
The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections which shall be by universal and equal suffrage and shall be held by secret vote or by equivalent free voting procedures.
This clause, along with the rest of the Universal Declaration, which reads almost like a clinical summary of the liberal syndrome, won for its adoption in 1948 the affirmative votes of the representatives of Juan Perón, King Saud, the Imam of Yemen, the Emperor of Ethiopia, the Shah of Persia and Fulgencio Batista. Liberalism tends toward a plebiscitary interpretation of democracy. Government ought to reflect the will of the democratic majority as immediately, sensitively and accurately as possible. Liberals thus distrust those political institutions and processes that mediate, deflect, distort or otherwise interfere with the direct expression of the popular will, such as, for example, the electoral college method of electing chief magistrates, the non-proportional basis for electing the United States Senate and other upper chambers, and, as we have noted, the non-democratic procedural rules that characterize American and many other legislative assemblies. Liberal fundamentalists usually favor the election of the head of government by a direct consultation of the electorate as a whole, that is, by a plebiscite or something approximating a plebiscite. Their distrust of intermediate political institutions also leads modern liberals, in this respect very different from their namesakes of a century ago, to favor centralization of governmental power. Decentralization, such as persists in the American federal structure in spite of a century's erosion, and the whole tradition of states' rights, whether in the United States, the Congo, India or Kenya, become in practice, as the liberal sees it, instruments of reactionary minorities that break up and often thwart the democratic will of the majority. 13. From the theoretical point of view, there is no reason why democratic centralization should stop with the single nation. Modern liberal doctrine tends naturally toward internationalist conceptions and the ideal of a democratic world order based through one mode or another on the majority will of all mankind. The logic of liberal principle unites with the normal bias of liberal temperament to incline modern liberals favorably toward ideas, movements and organizations that can be thought of as steps toward world cooperation, federalism, unification in government, world courts, world leagues of nations, worldwide cultural exchanges, world congresses and parliaments, world conventions and committees. To the liberal it has become self-evident that national sovereignty is an outworn concept that must be drastically modified if not altogether abandoned.
Experience since the Second World War should have made it clear that a liberal foreign policy must assume that liberalism and democracy can only flourish or indeed survive in a suitable environment, that such an environment under present conditions can be no less extensive than the entire world, and that, therefore, liberal foreign policy must look at the world as a whole. Any form of isolationism and regionalism is obsolete. The nation that would save itself must subordinate its immediate interests to the maintenance of a peaceful, stable, and just world. That is the assumption that the United States and other nations made in establishing the United Nations.
In this passage, Professor Wright's initial appeal to experience since the Second World War is altogether unnecessary, and certainly incapable of proving the extreme and unqualified assertions that follow. What makes them persuasive to Professor Wright, and to liberal readers, has nothing to do with experience, it is, rather, their intellectual and emotional cohesion with the corpus of the liberal ideology. The platform of Americans for Democratic Action has declared year after year that, support of the principles of the United Nations, no reference is made to the national interests of the United States, is, i.e., ought to be from the standpoint of liberalism, the cornerstone of our foreign policy. In its official program, ADA describes itself as
dedicated to the achievement of freedom and economic security for all people everywhere.
Not just for fellow nationals. ADA's founding charter, 1947, declared unequivocally,
the establishment of a world government with powers adequate to prevent war must be an objective of the United States foreign policy to be achieved at the earliest possible date.
These forthright statements push things further than many liberals are prepared to do at present, but in making them, ADA has been loyal to the spirit and logic of liberalism. Liberalism's internationalist tendency has been traced at this point to its doctrine of democratic sovereignty, which in turn is linked to the beliefs about human nature, social reform and the universal dialogue. As we shall see, an internationalist attitude is also promoted, in fact required, by the liberal concepts of equality. 14. In liberalism's relativist theory of truth and democratic political doctrine, as in its account of human nature, there is no room for qualitative distinctions among men. In their essential attributes of plasticity and rationality, which are the attributes relevant to political and social affairs, men do not differ qualitatively, their differences are only quantitative, each man counts for one and one only. The right man to govern and the right policy to pursue, like, in the last analysis, the good and the true and even the beautiful, are known by counting the votes, each man counting for one, in the ballot box. This man, that man, this or that woman are all alike common men, all are humanity or mankind. Former Vice President Henry Wallace was correctly expressing the liberal aspiration in naming ours the century of the common man. Thus liberalism tends to be egalitarian. Professor Oakeshott brings this out along a somewhat different perspective.
From this politics of perfection springs the politics of uniformity, a scheme which does not recognize circumstance can have no place for variety. There must in the nature of things be one best form of government which all intellects, sufficiently roused from the slumber of savage ignorance, will be irresistibly incited to approve, writes Godwin. This intrepid rationalist states in general what a more modest believer might prefer to assert only in detail, but the principle holds, there may not be one universal remedy for all political ills, but the remedy for any particular ill is as universal in its application as it is rational in its conception. If the rational solution for one of the problems of a society, segregation in school classrooms, let us cite as an example, has been determined to permit any relevant part of the society to escape from the solution is, ex hypothesi, to countenance irrationality.
The egalitarianism that lurks in the ideology found its first practical expression in the political field, with the liberal program for universal and equal suffrage unrestricted by property, sex, race, color, religion or ancestry. It then spread to the economic and social fields, where the egalitarianism takes the practical form of progressive income and inheritance taxes, or direct expropriation when impatience spurs a more rapid approach to the ideal, subsidies under one or another formula to the poorer strata of the population, and movements for universal equality in arrangements for education, residence, jobs, recreation and transportation, employment, housing, education, transportation, suffrage, and all other aspects of public and community life, is the inclusive coverage given by the ADA program. Liberals differ among themselves in the totality of their commitment to egalitarianism. For most liberals, the egalitarian tendency is not extended to every conceivable field, and it is carried further in some fields than in others. Just where limits are to be drawn is a problem rather for intuition, even if unacknowledged, than for logic, since from a purely logical point of view there seems to be no particular reason to draw the line short of the extremist limit. In economic matters, for example, all liberals favor taxation, subsidy, welfare and relief policies that have the effect, or are intended to have the effect, of cutting down the differential between wealthy and poor, that is, have an egalitarian effect, so far as they go. But few liberals insist on an absolute even-steven quantitative sharing of the wealth, though the slogan proves attractive to the liberal rank and file, not surprisingly, since it expresses basic liberal ideology in impulse. It is observable that liberals aim sharper polemics against capital than against income. Capital, especially in the form of real property but in some degree all large accumulations of capital, usually is bound up with the past, with the family, even with local domicile and tradition. Thus capital, from the standpoint of liberal principles, seems more irrational and backward-looking than income, which may be thought to be the product of intellectual talents similar to those that enable a bright student to score well in examinations, therefore qualifying as rational, up to a point. It may have some significance that a good many thorough liberals possess talents of this sort, and make successful use of them. 15. Looked at somewhat differently, liberalism's egalitarianism is equivalent to a tendency, and we must continue to speak here of tendencies, rather than of anything absolute, against social hierarchies and distinctions, against those factors in human life that mark off one group of men from the rest of mankind. In accord with the general principles of the liberal ideology, this anti-hierarchical or anti-discriminatory tendency is especially pronounced when the operative distinction marking off the group is based, as most social distinctions are in fact based, on factors of tradition, custom, prejudice, superstition or sentiment that liberalism regards as non-rational. Thus liberals are anti-aristocratic, and are opposed to political, economic or social distinctions based on family, religion or property, especially landed property, and perhaps most passionately of all to distinctions based on race or color. Not only do liberals want schools to be integrated with respect to all such attributes, they also reject quota systems, especially systems related to race, color or religion, in admitting students to universities and professional institutions. A quota system could satisfy the ideal of arithmetic equality, but would imply qualitative discriminations. In setting admission priorities, liberals usually object to any preference shown to athletic prowess, appearance, character, or exemplification of American, or British or French as the case may be, ideals, all of which are judged to be irrational factors. Liberals object also to a selection based on money, which follows, unless counterbalanced, from the fact that some families have the money to pay the fees and others don't. This objection has led in recent years to the general current practice of awarding scholarship funds primarily in terms of financial need. Need, evidently, does not seem an irrational criterion from a liberal standpoint, though it is not altogether easy for a non-liberal to see just where the difference is. The priority scale actually in force in the major universities, based on certain rather specialized intellectual skills and attainments, likewise qualifies, it would seem, as rational. From the standpoint of the liberal ideology, it is difficult to justify the strong attachments so often found in the past to such non-rational human groupings as the family or the nation, or indeed to any groupings more parochial than mankind. Not surprisingly, we find that most liberals favor easy divorce laws. Indeed, these are ordinarily called liberal divorce laws. Liberals and their forebears have carried the brunt of the campaigns that over the past 150 years have so greatly loosened the bonds of matrimony. Liberals, unless they are professional politicians needing votes in the hinterland, are not subject to strong feelings of national patriotism and are likely to feel uneasy at patriotic ceremonies. These, like the organizations in whose conduct they are still manifest, are dismissed by liberals rather scornfully as flag-waving and 100% Americanism. The national anthem is not customarily sung or the flag shown, unless prescribed by law, at meetings of liberal associations. When a liberal journalist uses the phrase patriotic organization, the adjective is equivalent in meaning to stupid, reactionary and rather ludicrous. The rise of liberalism to predominance in the controlling sectors of American opinion is in almost exact correlation with the decline in the ceremonial celebration of the 4th of July, traditionally regarded as the nation's major holiday. To the liberal mind, the patriotic oratory is not only banal but subversive of rational ideals, and judged by liberalism's humanitarian morality, the enthusiasm and pleasures that simple souls might have got from the fireworks could not compensate the occasional damage to the eye or finger of an unwary youngster. The purer liberals of the Norman cousin strain, in the tradition of Eleanor Roosevelt, are more likely to celebrate UN Day than the 4th of July. This cooling off of patriotic feeling, which reinforces the liberal tendency toward internationalism that we have already remarked, is not at all an arbitrary quirk of liberal sentiment. Modern liberals, in their emotional shift, are true to their principles. They are, in effect, bringing the older liberalism, which was nationalistic, sometimes very fiercely so, in its day, when the logic of liberalism was only half spun out, up to date. Patriotism and nationalism, too, are non-rational and discriminatory. They invidiously divide, segregate, one group of men, my group, from humanity, and do so not in accord with objective merits determined by deliberate reason but as the result of habits, customs, traditions and feelings inherited from the past. Patriotism and patriotic nationalism thus come under liberalism's logical taboo. The duty of the fully enlightened liberal, as the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy reminds us in frequent public declarations, is to nothing less than mankind. 16. Liberalism's democratic, egalitarian and universalist beliefs seem to entail a principle that might be put as follows: subgroups of humanity defined by color, race, sex or other physical or physiological attributes do not differ in civilizing potential. Individuals obviously do differ in this respect, either congenitally or from variations in education and environmental influence, and even the most orthodox liberal is willing to put those individuals whose negative differences are extreme into jail or asylum. But these individual differences, liberal doctrine would seem to hold, are random in humanity at large, and not correlated with any generalized physical or physiological differences. Perhaps in pure logic this principle is not a necessary presupposition of the democratic, egalitarian and universalist beliefs, but in any event I have never known of a liberal who denied it publicly. It is not hard to see why this should be so. Suppose I believe that men of a certain color, size or shape, or in some other way physically marked off as a group, are in point of fact distinctly inferior, on average, to other men in their ability to create and maintain a civilized society. I might still think that this inferior group and its members should be equal in certain respects to all other men, equal as moral beings and equal before the law, let us say. And I might still judge it proper that exceptional members of the inferior group should be free to rise to whatever social level might be consonant with their talents. But it would be imprudent, and manifestly dangerous both for society and for the inferior group itself, if as a group, no matter how large, no matter if it were a sizable majority of mankind, it were granted the same share as superior groups in running things, if, in other words, the inferior group were granted political equality. By the hypothesis of its inferiority, it could not be expected to run things as well, and it might run them very badly indeed. Of course, even if I share the liberal belief that in objective fact all groups are equal in civilizing potential, it still does not follow that I must accept liberalism's political conclusion. I might continue to want my group to have more than its arithmetic share in running things, simply because it is my group, or because that's the way it's been for a long time and things might get worse if big changes were made, but then I would no longer be reasoning like a liberal, or feeling as a sincere liberal ought to feel. 17. Liberalism, with its optimism about human nature and social progress, its confidence in science, its rejection of non-rational modes of knowledge and its democratic egalitarianism, is secularist in outlook and goal. It is secularist philosophically, in the definition of its ideal as something to be realized in this world, not the next. Its paradise is earthly, the purpose of society and government is the improvement of the material life of mankind through the elimination of poverty, hunger, slums, oppression, physical suffering and war. And liberalism is secularist in the practical political sense of opposing the theological state and, more generally, the intrusion of the church into government. The forebears of modern liberalism often supported this secularism in social outlook by an all-sided attack on organized religion.
In its militant aspect,
Professor Shapiro summarizes.
The secularism of the Enlightenment warred against all revealed religions as having their origin in the fears and superstitions of primitive life. According to secularism, man's supreme aim was to attain happiness in this world through mundane ideas and scientific method. Most of the thinkers of the Enlightenment believed in deism, or natural religion, according to which God created the world and the natural laws that governed it. But they disbelieved in theological dogmas, flouted rituals, and repudiated churches.
In the second half of the 19th century, the deism gave way in the case of some of the pre-liberals to proclaimed atheism or agnosticism, as is true of some of the older generations still living, Bertrand Russell, for example, or Max Eastman, who has dropped his liberalism but kept his atheism. Avowed atheism and agnosticism are no longer fashionable, but most modern liberals maintain strict views about separation of church and state, though this is an issue on which Catholic converts to liberalism continue to be troubled. According to liberal doctrine, religion, separated by a solid wall from the state, is a private affair, a question of individual belief and private, voluntary association. 18. Because coercion and force are felt to be intrinsically irrational, and because they undoubtedly interrupt the universal dialogue of the democratic process, liberals tend, here again it is a tendency that is in question, to be against both war and warriors. Some liberals, and an increasing number since the advent of nuclear weapons, go all the way to strict pacificism, others, to the myriad sorts of modified or conditional pacifism like the movements for partial or total disarmament, against nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons tests, and so on. There are some pacifists who reach their position through special sorts of anarchism, of both left and right varieties, and more who derive it from religious belief, and some seeming pacifists are communists in pacifist clothing. But most present-day pacifists of all shades, including most of the religious pacifists, are liberals, as can quickly be confirmed by checking the membership of any of the pacifist, anti-bomb or disarmament organizations. The veteran liberal, Walter Millis, now a prominent associate of Mr. Hutchins' Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, sets down what he evidently takes as an axiom in his analysis of the liberal military defense policy.
It is difficult to see how a liberal statesmanship in the modern era can take as its ultimate goal anything less than the abolition of the war system itself. The abolition of war appears to demand, as its minimum requirement, and its minimum consequence, a universal and total disarmament, down to police force levels, by all the nations of the world.
Some liberals, especially among those currently charged with the practical conduct of military defense policy, will doubtless feel that Mr. Millis' formulation is too unqualified, but it may be recalled that, following an initiative taken by Nikita Khrushchev, all member nations of the United Nations are on formal record as favoring a universal and total disarmament, down to police force levels. No liberal would declare himself flatly against disarmament. Every liberal approves some sort of disarmament, at least, in principle. All liberals, by the nature of liberalism, always favor discussion, negotiation and compromise, the normal liberal procedures, as the methods for settling all disputes.
We must go on negotiating,
declared Senator Hubert Humphrey on his return in 1960 from his 7-hour dialogue with Khrushchev.
We must be willing to talk to the Russians, and whomever, wherever and whenever there seems to be the faintest hope.
19. One rather drastic and very important change that modern liberalism has made in the ideology that was called liberalism in the 19th century is well known and often commented on. The liberal economists, moralists and philosophers of the 19th century tended toward a doctrine of laissez-faire that set strict boundaries to the field of government. John Stuart Mill, still hailed by his most recent editor, Max Lerner, as high priest of reason, gave insistent and repeated utterance to his distrust of governmental operations that reached out beyond narrowly circumscribed limits. Mill opposed out of hand, of course, government interference with a citizen's liberty of thought, speech and action, except where this interference might be necessary to prevent that citizen from injuring the liberties of another. But beyond this, Mill is at repeated pains to make explicit the objections to government interference, when it is not such as to involve infringement of liberty, that is, to government interference in general. These objections he summarizes near the close of On Liberty as follows.
The first is, when the thing to be done is likely to be better done by individuals than by the government. The second objection is, that, in many cases, though individuals may not do the particular thing so well, on the average, as the officers of government, it is nevertheless desirable that it should be done by them, rather than by the government, as a means to their own mental education. The third, and most cogent reason for restricting the interference of government, is the great evil of adding unnecessarily to its power. Every function superadded to those already exercised by the government causes its influence over hopes and fears to be more widely diffused, and converts, more and more, the active and ambitious part of the public into hangers-on of the government, or of some part which aims at becoming the government. If the roads, the railways, the banks, the insurance offices, the great joint stock companies, the universities, and the public charities were all of them branches of the government, if, in addition, the municipal corporations and local boards, with all that now devolves on them, became departments of the central administration, if the employees of all these different enterprises were appointed and paid by the government, and looked to the government for every rise in life, not all the freedom of the press and popular constitution of the legislature would make this or any other country free otherwise than in name.
This reads like pure Barry Goldwater. It would surely get an applicant blackballed by Americans for democratic action, and most probably exiled from the new frontier. Mr. Hutchins, in the address from which I have several times drawn, expresses the point of view of present-day liberalism.
The notion that the sole concern of a free society is the limitation of governmental authority and that government is best which governs least is certainly archaic. Our object today should not be to weaken government in competition with other centers of power, but rather to strengthen it as the agency charged with the responsibility for the common good.
The older liberalism believed, thus, in a limited state. In particular, the positive or substantive tasks assigned to government were very few, besides defense against foreign aggression and domestic violence, perhaps the provision of a small number of essential public services. For the rest, the government's duties as defined by the older liberalism were largely negative, to prevent the kind of fraud, coercion or monopoly practices that blocked the exercise of civil liberties and the processes of the free market. Even with respect to civil rights and liberties, the function of government was thought of as negative, not to bring about or compel the substantive enjoyment of the liberties, much less to create them, but merely to prevent coercive interference with their enjoyment by citizens who might choose to exercise them. Modern liberalism has shifted to a belief in one or another degree of what may properly be called in a general sense, statism. It has an always critical and sometimes wholly negative attitude toward private economic enterprise. It was the liberals and pre-liberals who popularized the conception of the major individualist entrepreneurs as robber barons, of the companies that furnish armament as merchants of death. Liberals accept and advocate a multiplication of the substantive activities of government in nearly all social dimensions, extensive government controls over the economy, and at least some measure of government ownership and operation. Modern liberalism insists that the entry of government into nearly every phase of social life except religion aids rather than hinders the attainment of the good life and the good society. It is evident that in thus changing, in fact very nearly reversing, the inherited doctrine of the relation between state and society, modern liberalism has absorbed an important segment of the ideology of socialism. Liberalism does not, it is true, share the total demand of orthodox Marxian socialism, for nationalization of all major means of production, transport and distribution, and we have noted that the non-communist socialist parties in most Western nations have also dropped this extreme position during the course of the past decade or so. The ideological movement has gone both ways, just as liberalism shifted toward socialism in its doctrine of the state and its economics, so has the reformist or democratic wing of traditional socialism shifted toward liberalism. The two have come close to meeting in the concept of what has come to be called the welfare state, and there they meet up also with still other currents from radicalism, Christian socialism and even modern, as it is sometimes designated, conservatism. Undoubtedly liberals differ a good deal among themselves in the degree of their statism. Some incline more toward Marx, some toward John Maynard Keynes, and there are still perhaps a few who have an occasional hankering after John Stuart Mill. But all modern liberals agree that government has a positive duty to make sure that the citizens have jobs, food, clothing, housing, education, medical care, security against sickness, unemployment and old age, and that these should be ever more abundantly provided. In fact, a government's duty in these respects, if sufficient resources are at its disposition, is not only to its own citizens but to all humanity. Contemporary American liberals are probably unanimous, for example, in accepting an obligation, to be implemented at least in part through government, to help feed and succor the hungry of the underdeveloped regions, and to aid them in improving their material condition. Whatever the measure of a liberal's theoretical statism, liberals almost always support the side of government control, planning, financing or takeover when this is posed as a specific issue. In Congress, for example, the record of the liberal bloc on such issues shows few exceptions over the past generation. Since its founding in 1947, the Liberal Collegium, Americans for Democratic Action, has published an annual score sheet after each session of Congress. Every congressman gets a rating according to his votes on 15 or 20 measures that are selected as the most significant of the session, a plus if he has voted the ADA, that is the liberal, line, a minus if he has voted anti-liberal. Hundreds of bills have thus appeared on the score sheets over the years. The ADA has invariably assigned a plus to a vote for a measure that entails an increase in the power of the federal, that is, national, executive or that authorizes more spending, control, planning or activity by any branch of the federal government, with the sole exception of control over free speech, assembly and subversion. Conversely, a vote for any of the infrequent measures that call for a reduction in the power or purse of the federal government is invariably rated minus. The platforms and programs of Americans for Democratic Action are studded with statements that motivate these ratings by appeal to the principles and rhetoric of the liberal ideology.
The leadership role of the federal government is central to the achievement of growth and full employment. The government must undertake to build firm foundations for enduring prosperity by bold long-range programs for the development of our resources, the rebuilding of our cities, the elimination of our slums, and the provision of full and equal opportunities for health, education, and security for all our people. Government subsidies and financing and, if necessary, government plants must be used to provide more power, more steel, and other vitally necessary raw materials.
That last is from a vintage platform of the late 1940s, before it became clear to everyone that more steel plants besides what private industry built on its own account were far from a burning economic need.
The government needs increased authority over the amount of bank credit and bank resources. Housing goals must be set by the federal government.
In January 1962, ADA's official organ, ADA World, demanded, along with full government Medicare and care of the aged,
a broad and comprehensive federal program for schools, hospitals, cultural and recreational centers, mass transit and water supply systems.
In the 1962 session of Congress, the Senate's liberal bloc under the leadership of ADA members fought for a government-owned, as against industry-owned, high-voltage power transmission grid just as it fought against assigning the operation of communication satellites to a group of private corporations. Gazing out into space, the liberals, unappeased by the progress toward the welfare state on Earth, see new worlds to plan for. Both those 1962 battles were lost. As it happened, the liberal fundamentalists had jumped beyond the president as well as their more moderate brethren. The leap from the concept of the limited state to that of the welfare state is a wide one. In effective terms, it means a reversal of emotive priorities, with the impulse toward social reform, always present in liberalism but formerly in second rank, taking precedence over the libertarian impulse. Logically, the leap has not been achieved without a good deal of doctrinal acrobatics, even, perhaps, some signs of a strained backbone. The gap has been bridged, if precariously, with the help of the theory and practice of political democracy. If we consider the problem historically, we will recall that for the 18th and 19th century liberal ancestors, the state meant a non-democratic regime in which such conservative and reactionary forces, according to their listing in the liberal lexicon, as landlords, a hereditary aristocracy, a hereditary monarch, the army and the church had weight much beyond their numerical proportion. This was true of the regime as a whole, and to a large extent even of the parliaments within the regime, which were elected on a limited, manipulated franchise, and wielded in any case only portions of the power. Such a state was obviously not a very promising instrument for bringing about the liberties, reforms, and general prosperity which the pre-liberals sought. In fact, the active intervention of government could be expected to push, much of the time, in the opposite direction. With the gradual extension of the franchise toward universality and the transfer of sovereignty more and more fully into the hands of elective assemblies and officials, the state could be thought of as changing its character from bad to good, or at least promising angel. The state came to seem to express more and more, at least more than other institutions, the popular or general will. It was no longer outlandish for liberals to expect their democratic state to do liberalism's work. John Dewey probably did as much as any man to engineer this dialectical shift. The older liberalism, with its belief in laissez-faire and the limited state, he concluded,
is in effect simply a justification of the brutalities and inequities of the existing order. Gradually a change came over the spirit and meaning of liberalism. It came surely, if gradually, to be disassociated from the laissez-faire creed and to be associated with the use of governmental action for aid to those at economic disadvantage and for alleviation of these conditions. The majority of those who call themselves liberals today are committed to the principle that organized society must use its powers to establish the conditions under which the mass of individuals can possess actual as distinct from merely legal liberty.
He completes the turn with a triumphant Hegelian synthesis.
Since liberation of the capacities of individuals for free, self-initiated expression is an essential part of the creed of liberalism, liberalism that is sincere must will the means that condition the achieving of its ends. Regimentation of material and mechanical forces is the only way by which the mass of individuals can be released from regimentation. The notion,
still held by some people in 1935,
that organized social control,
a Deweyite expression for state control,
of economic forces lies outside the historic path of liberalism shows that liberalism is still impeded by remnants of its earlier laissez-faire phase. Earlier liberalism regarded the separate and competing economic action of individuals as the means to social well-being as the end. We must reverse the perspective and see that socialized economy is the means of free individual development as the end.
Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., sticking to his last, very naturally calls first on American history rather than Germanic metaphysics for a helping hand across the gap.
American democracy emerged in an age which had conquered freedom by limiting the power of government.
He wrote in The Vital Center.
This experience had a traumatic effect on the early radicals. The state had given them, so to speak, a prenatal fright.
But Mr. Schlesinger finds it possible to date the beginning of their recovering from this infantile sickness of liberalism, as we might call it, borrowing from Lenin, all the way back to Andrew Jackson, the subject of Mr. Schlesinger's first Pulitzer Prize and book club selection.
The administration of Andrew Jackson was the first one to govern energetically in the interests of the people.
Mr. Schlesinger does not specify whose interests Washington, Jefferson and Jackson's other predecessors governed in, but in any case it was not the people's.
But, in order to combat the power of concentrated wealth, Jackson was obliged to enlarge the power of the state. Under the banner of anti-statism, Jackson made the state stronger than ever before.
It turns out that Germanic metaphysics cannot be dispensed with after all. The contradictories, statism and anti-statism, fuse into the synthesis of popular, democratic government. The next boost comes from Theodore Roosevelt, who
was the first modern statesman to note the spirit of irresponsibility which was suffusing industrial society and to call upon positive government to redress the balance. In so doing, he invoked the dream of the benevolent state,
i.e., what came to be known as the welfare state. Under the next Roosevelt and the New Deal occasion, in Mr. Schlesinger's rendering of subsequent prizes and book club choices, the dream begins its translation into reality.
The New Deal completed the exorcism of Jeffersonian inhibitions about strong government, committing liberals ever after to the Hamilton TR faith in the state as a necessary instrument of social welfare.
In recent years the revised doctrine has become ever more persuasive as the liberals themselves have moved into commanding posts within the governmental structure, particularly in the executive and the permanent bureaucracy. Surely it would be quixotic for liberals to distrust unduly or to strive to limit strictly a state that they are themselves running. These 19 ideas, principles and beliefs comprise the primary elements of the liberal ideology, the symptoms of the liberal syndrome. Although I have used American references, for the most part, in displaying them, they are not peculiar to American liberalism, but common to liberalism everywhere in the world, though we should keep in mind that in other countries liberals in the American sense may be called, as we have noted, by different names: progressives, radicals, social democrats, democratic socialists, Christian democrats, la gauche, el sinistrismo, Fabians, the left, leftists, progressists, laborites, and so on. In some instances the groups that would be so designated overlap rather than coincide with liberals in the American sense. Indeed, the logic of the liberal doctrine necessarily yields principles that are internationalist and universal rather than local or national. Because of their prominence and practical importance, I add, without comment or analysis, three corollaries of the basic doctrine that the American form of liberalism applies in its particular context. A. American liberalism tends to a thoroughly instrumentalist interpretation of the Constitution, and holds that the meaning of the Constitution should be understood as wholly dependent on time and circumstance. Actually, liberalism is logically committed to such an interpretation of any constitution, written or unwritten. B. Modern American liberalism, in theory and even more consistently in practice, has only a minor concern for, or even a definite opposition to, states' rights. Both on doctrinal grounds and because of the non-liberal social forces that often find expression in the institutions of the several states, liberalism sees the federal, central, national, government as the more promising instrument of progress, and the state structures as obstacles. C. Since the executive, along with the bureaucracy, is naturally the coordinating and dynamic branch of the American form of government, through which progress can most readily be assured and the welfare state developed, American liberalism has a strong presumption in favor of the executive as against the legislature, that is, Congress. Its attitude, like that of non-liberals, toward the judiciary tends to be opportunist, determined by the current ideological makeup of the bench, in particular of the controlling Supreme Court. The liberals are pro-court when it is handing down liberal decisions, and anti-court when it is on an anti-liberal swing. But the preference for the executive, and bureaucracy, is much more stable, a matter of principle rather than of immediate tactics. In his History of Americans for Democratic Action, to which I have made reference, Professor Brock both discusses and illustrates this liberal predilection for the executive.
Since the first 100 days of the New Deal,
he summarizes,
if not since the time of Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom, American liberals have looked to the executive branch to supply the political power for the great changes which slowly transformed the nation from a laissez-faire to a welfare state. Except for a brief period in the late 20s, liberals have carried on a long love affair with the presidency.